This is Matthew Cratter from Trader University, and today I want to talk about Bitcoin, Russia, and financial sanctions. In particular, I want to talk about an article that many of you have sent me, and this is really a good example of journalism at its worst. It's called Financial Sanctions Are Easier Than Ever for Russians to Evade. Think Bitcoin. So this is one of those articles, if you're just skimming through CNN and you see this, you might be tempted to say, oh, there's that Bitcoin again causing all these problems. And I think this is really the whole point of the article, but it's a very misleading article. I think it's still interesting to talk about. It starts off with this picture, of course, of the Bitfinex money launderers, or alleged money launderers, I should say. Now, the woman on the right is an American. The guy on the left does have a Russian passport. I believe he was born in Russia and spent most of his childhood and adult life in the U.S. But these two are actually completely unrelated to the story. But it is a subtle and unconscious way of linking to allegedly bad people with Bitcoin. So it does serve that function. You could read more about them in the Justice Department release, which I'll link to below. So if you go through and read this article, they're relying heavily on an expert named Ross Delston. And one of the things that he says at the beginning of the article, he's quoted as saying, if the Russians decide, and they're already doing this, I'm sure, to avoid using any currency other than cryptocurrency, they can effectively avoid virtually all the sanctions, said Ross S. Delston, an expert on anti-money laundering compliance. Now, we know this is just not true. The Russians are not using only cryptocurrencies at this point. We talked about the Russia-China 30-year pipeline deal that settles in euros. So it is true that Russia has been trying to move away from using the U.S. dollar for the past 8 years or so, but they're increasingly doing commerce and trade in currencies like the euro and the yuan. If you take a look at the reserves of the National Wealth Fund in Russia, the yuan accounted for 30% of it. So they've definitely been doing some trade with China in order to get their hands on that much yuan, because it's not a convertible currency, so you actually have to earn it. So this part is completely not true, that they've somehow completely moved to cryptocurrencies. But the whole point of this article is to be quite misleading, as we're going to see. If you're finding this video helpful so far, be sure to hit that subscribe and like button. Maybe share this video with a few friends as well. So later on in the article, the same guy is quoted as saying, of course, evading sanctions isn't as easy as dumping all your dollar-denominated funds into Bitcoin. It's hard to buy anything with crypto, especially big stuff, Delston says, and this is still a quote from him. Take food, for example, which Russia historically has imported. Is a food exporter somewhere in the world going to accept cryptocurrency that fluctuates every day? And it's very interesting. We see this interplay between using the word Bitcoin and using the word cryptocurrency. So Bitcoin gets blamed in the title, but throughout the whole article, it's always talking about cryptocurrency, which I find interesting. To continue with the quote, is a food exporter somewhere in the world going to accept cryptocurrency that fluctuates every day, every moment of every day, or are they going to want the world's reserve currency, U.S. dollars? So this is an amazing move by Ross. He's able to bring in the Bitcoin is too volatile FUD, but in doing so, he really contradicts his whole point. Is it very difficult? Is it hard to buy anything with Bitcoin or crypto? Is Bitcoin too volatile? If so, Bitcoin can't be used to evade sanctions. So you can either have it one way or the other. You can use it to buy things and evade sanctions, or it's too volatile and too hard to buy anything with it. So this article, it has all these internal contradictions that are actually quite laughable and should have been taken care of by an editor. If CNN was still a real institution. I'm old enough to remember what CNN looked like in the 1990s, and it was actually an intelligent news organization at that point. At this point, it's complete garbage, as you can see by the kinds of articles that it publishes. The weird thing about this guy, they keep quoting this Ross Delston. It seems like he has an agenda of some sort or an alternative take on things. So I decided to look him up, And of course, we learned that he is an anti-money laundering specialist and former U.S. banking regulator, used to work for the FDIC. And of course, as we would expect, he's a consultant to the IMF. And he's also in very close contact, not just with the IMF, the World Bank, the FDIC, but also the People's Bank of China. So this is one of those guys, one of those international guys who seems to have something against Bitcoin, and we can see why he might if he's part of the IMF, World Bank, and China crowd. You'll see a lot of articles like this going forward, blaming Bitcoin for something that's happening in Russia, blaming Bitcoin for white supremacy, blaming Bitcoin for something on the left, blaming Bitcoin for something on the right. And people forget this is the whole point of a neutral currency. Everyone can use it. People to the left, people to the right, good people, bad people. The difficult thing about enforcing who gets to use your currency, first of all, you end up excluding a lot of people if you don't want certain types of people to use your currency. But also you have this tricky situation where who gets to decide who the good guys and the bad guys are. In some cases, it's quite clear. In many cases, it's much more of a gray line. And one of the problems with the US dollar is become weaponized. It has become a hammer that the US uses to accomplish political goals. So it's a currency that's become highly politicized, and this doesn't bode well for its future. We want a completely neutral currency. So going forward, I think you'll see a lot of articles blaming Bitcoin for this, blaming Bitcoin for that. And it's important to realize that good and bad people use the internet, good and bad people use the US dollar, good and bad people use the euro. But it doesn't make those technologies, those money technologies, any worse for that reason. Good and bad people use fire, for example, is the classic example. And when it comes to currencies, we want a neutral settlement asset. What I would say, if this article had done its research, there are some interesting things going on in Russia in terms of the politics of Bitcoin. And in retrospect, we may be able to see some of this as leading up to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. What happened back in January of this year is the Russian central bank tried to propose a blanket ban on Bitcoin, on mining, on trading, on the usage of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. What was very interesting is they were immediately fought by the finance ministry. And the finance ministry, Ministry of Finance, said something very smart. We need to give these technologies the opportunity to develop. In this regard, the Ministry of Finance is actively involved in the development of legislative initiatives in terms of regulating this market. And then what we saw recently, as a week or two ago, the Russian government and the central bank came to this agreement to regulate Bitcoin, to really control it in a very KYC manner. You have to report if you're moving more than 6,000 rubles, which is roughly $8,000. It's probably a little bit less now that the ruble's been crashing. But this progression from an outright ban, and then the federal government, the Russian government overturning the central bank's wishes, is very, very interesting to see. And I think one of the reasons for this, obviously Putin is a very smart guy, and he was quoted as saying on January 26th in a meeting with government officials that despite the risks of Bitcoin that were warned by the central bank, the country, Russia, has some competitive advantages in Bitcoin mining due to its power surplus as one of the world's greatest and largest energy producers and trained workforce. So the mining angle comes in here, which is very, very interesting. This is the Kommersant article that was published. I just translated it into English from Russian. It's obviously a pretty bad translation. The title of this, Everything Secret Will Become Mining. I'm not sure what those of you who speak Russian can take a look at this and tell me what it means. But it does talk about a proposed plan for how to regulate cryptocurrencies. And it's going to be a very highly regulated system where basically Bitcoin is absorbed into the banking system. But this is very different from a ban. And it's very interesting to see Russia move in this direction. And I think it tells us something about Bitcoin, and it tells us something about energy. Because Bitcoin uses proof of work and has this link, this anchor to the real world, it's very, very likely that we see a marriage between the global energy system and Bitcoin. We've talked about this in other videos before, how Bitcoin uses renewables, it uses stranded energy, it helps to balance out the power grid, and increasingly Bitcoin could become a neutral reserve, a neutral settlement asset for energy and commodity trade. And I think it's very likely, in fact, that in the coming years we're going to see crude oil, natural gas, coal, electricity, power, and energy all being priced in Bitcoin because of this proof of work connection. So I think Russia is very smart to not be completely banning this, but to remain interacting with the Bitcoin network. And again, the Bitcoin network is permissionless. It's open to anyone. We don't get to decide who interacts with it, but incentives do drive things. And if you're a large energy producer like Russia or like the United States, you better get your act together and figure out this coming connection between energy and Bitcoin. Bitcoin being the only global neutral settlement asset. Right now, most energy trade settles in US dollars, but we could see this moving to Bitcoin in the future, which would be very interesting indeed. If you found this video helpful, be sure to hit that subscribe and like button. Hit the notification bell if you want to be notified when I publish my next video. And let me know your questions and comments in the comment section below. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.